Hello, welcome back to the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library Annual Hudson Valley History Reading Festival. I'm Paul Sparrow. I'm the director at the FDR Library here. We're about to get started on our third session today. This is going to be a good one. It's a contemporary look at our beloved Hudson Valley after the historical one from our David Levine. Judith Linville is the author of Reflections, Statsburg, Not Just a Place to Live, a collection of interviews with community members. Judy has lived in Statsburg for over 40 years, where she and her husband Bob raised 2 children. Judy is a writer who has recorded personal essays on Northeast Public Radio and is a former English teacher and retired principal. Enjoys being a grandparent and a community volunteer. Statsburg is a very important community in relationship to the Roosevelts, as I'm sure we'll hear about. But Judy, take over.
Hi, everyone. I really wish I could be with you all in person, but it's really great to know that you're out there listening and interested in history. And thank you to Clifford Laub and to Paul for inviting me today. I'm really very pleased to talk about this wonderful community I live in. I like to start my presentations with these 2 quotes. The one by Eleanor Roosevelt, I think it really reflects the awesome people that I interviewed for this oral history project. And I think it reflects the sense of community that you're going to be hearing about for the next few minutes. And I think the oral histories contained in the book talk a lot about community and living cooperatively. The second quote is just true. People are hungry for stories. I truly believe that. We love storytelling. And of course, Studs Terkel really brought oral histories to the forefront in this country. And he started by interviewing World War II veterans, and he took off from there. So let's see what we have today. That, as Paul said, is the title of the book. And it all started when I moved into Statsburg with Bob and the 2 kids 40 years ago. And I started hearing stories that I really just couldn't believe about Statsburg back the turn of the century, the 20s, the 30s, when there were mansions and estates all along the river. And the old timers, as I called them in those days, told me about stores, a riverfront park, and it was not certainly the Statsburg that we had moved into. So I decided to find out more about it. And in the mid-'80s, I began this oral history project. I was fortunate enough to have a sabbatical from the Spackenkill School District that allowed me 6 months from my teaching position to do it. And I also got some local grants to work on interviewing 11 people, transcribing, gathering photographs to go with the information. But a couple of years ago, my husband suggested that we republish the book because we thought that people were moving into the hamlet and didn't realize, just as we didn't, what a place it was. And also because we thought it was time, again, to talk about the importance of community in our lives. So afterwards, I'll be glad to answer questions about the oral history process or anything else about the pictures if I can. What you'll be hearing mostly is me reading excerpts from the book from the wonderful people who were willing to talk to me all those years ago. All of these folks, I chose them. It was difficult to choose people to interview for this project, but I tried to do a cross-section of age groups and socioeconomic groups and different backgrounds, and here's what I came up with. Unfortunately, they've all passed away because they were quite elderly when I spoke to them, but I can never thank them enough for all that they gave to me and the people of Statsburg with their memories. I'd like to just point out at this point that what I did was what's loosely called social history. If you're looking for exact facts and researched history, it's not in this book, Reflections. What was important to me was what people remembered and how they perceived their lives as kids and their lives growing up in Statsburg. So just remember that what you're hearing might not always be exact, accurate fact, but it's, to me, more important. It's people and their memories. And this was mostly, we're focusing on the 1920s and the 1930s. If you're not familiar with the area we're talking about, It's probably hard doing this long distance for you to see the map, but down where we see the word Google is Route 9 going north, and then Route 9 is the yellow line that swings out and continues north. At the Y, the black straight line is Old Post Road, and that goes through the hamlet of Staatsburg. Again, down is the Anderson School for Autism, and this is where the beginning of 6 contiguous estates existed back from that point, from the Anderson School up to the Hopeland sign, where a lot of people now walk as Hopeland Trails. And that's some of the stories that I was hearing about these mansions and these estates. But again, my interest was in the people in the hamlet and how they related to those estates and how living near those estates affected them. The green area that you see on the map, of course, is now, over 1,000 acres of parkland. But the whole distance is only 4 miles where these 6 estates existed. So let's take a look. What made Statsburg unique in the early to mid-1900s? When our narrators were young, as I said, they had mansions with millionaires, this is Hopeland, as well as simple working class families. So starting down where I indicated at the Anderson Center for Autism was the Langdon estate called Manswood. The estate on the right is the Thompson Nori house, and that's called Stonehurst or Morgan Hall, and it was shared by 2 families. The sisters were who lived at the Thompson and Nori house. We'll talk more about that. Lydig Hoyt and his wife Blanche Livingston lived at the Point. This is a wonderful, beautiful building that's still in existence, although it's pretty much in ruins. But there is a Calvert Vaux Association that's working to renovate it, because Calvert Vaux, you may or may not know, who helped design Central Park, came up and did the landscaping here before he got the Central Park gig, obviously. But he did do the landscaping, so there's interest in restoring that. And the Mills Mansion, we all know that, Ogden Mills, that's still standing and part of the state. Now, these 2 homes are quite interesting. They were next to each other, not in close proximity, but they were next up the line. And Hopeland was the northernmost estate that we were just talking about. But what fascinates me is Helen Dinsmore Huntington Astor Hull lived in both of these homes. And I don't usually talk about the people who lived in the homes. That's not my interest. Again, it's with the people who lived in Statsburg. But Helen fascinated me because she grew up and moved between these 2 homes. The Locusts are the 2 photographs on the left, and Hopeland is the photograph on the right. And the reason that she did that was because her grandparents were, her maternal grandparents were the Dinsmores of the Locusts, and her paternal grandparents were the Huntingtons of Hopeland. In 1914, at age 21, Helen married William Vincent Astor, and that's from the family in Ferncliff in Rhinebeck. And of course, they had homes in New York City and elsewhere, but Helen wanted to be married at Hopeland, the home on the right, and she wanted to be married in the little country church in Statsburg. And that, of course, is our St. Margaret's Episcopal. Helen was a patron of the arts. She was on the board of directors of the New York City Ballet, the Metropolitan Opera, the New York Philharmonic, and Lincoln Center. She was good friends of Cole Porter, Elsa Maxwell, and Leonard Bernstein. It was said that she had galas at the Locusts, and she had Republican fundraisers at Hopeland, where President Hoover and Coolidge came to the house at times for these fundraisers. Helen was the guest of inaugural balls of Coolidge, Hoover, Eisenhower, and Nixon. So she lived a good, long life and was very politically active. She was a suffragette as well. She was an accomplished pianist, but she only performed in public once, and that was at Poughkeepsie High School, and Eleanor Roosevelt was in attendance. She inherited Hopeland, as I said, after her grandparents died. That was the 35-room home. And then in 1941, she inherited the Locusts. And at that time, she divorced Astor and married Lytle Hull, a real estate tycoon. Well, when she got the Locusts, she decided that that was too big and heavy a building. She had it totally torn down, and she built the home that you see on the right because she wanted a lighter mansion. That home on the right still stands in Statsburg. At one point, it was owned by the founder of Penthouse Magazine, Bob Guccione, and currently is owned by Andre Balazs, a hotelier who has properties all over the world. Then, in the early 50s, from what I can gather, she had the other mansion torn down, Hopeland, the 35-room mansion. For some reason, she just had it totally dismantled, and I've heard some guesses about why that happened, some of them focusing on the taxes that she had to pay. In 1976, Helen Dinsmore Huntington Astor Hull had a fall at the Locusts, and she passed away. But that's enough about her interesting life. Let's get back to Statsburg. This, as I said, the mansions were really a big source of employment. Initially, the whole hamlet really evolved as a service community to the great estates. But the people I talked to really loved having the estates along, and they were very proud of them. They bragged a lot about it. John Van Dyke, one of the people I interviewed, was born in 1904, and he moved to Statsburg when he was 7 because his father got a job on the Langdon estate. Again, that's the Anderson School for Autism. They lived in a little house on Route 9 with no electricity, no running water, and no toilet. And John told me they paid $4 a month until World War I, when they paid $5. And he worked at various estates along the river. John said, I went to work on the Mills estate and stayed there for 7 years. I worked raising chickens. We used to raise 10,000 chickens a year up there. That was about 1925. We used to kill a couple of hundred chickens a week for the big house. They had lots of parties. You know, millionaires only eat the breast and throw the rest of the chickens out. Another person I interviewed was Charlie Kendall, and Charlie was a wonderful storyteller. He was one of the people who got me interested. He loved Statsburg. He was born in Statsburg. His family moved away to Florida, but they came back in 1927 because his father had been killed in a car accident, and his mother, Charlie, and his sister, Elida, came back to what they knew. They came back to Statsburg. Charlie said, I can remember the Mills mansion in the wintertime. You could go sleigh riding on their hill, even when the family was there. What they would do was put lanterns out at night on the riverside of the mansion so you could sleigh ride at night. Then you could go down those steps to the basement area of the mansion, and the cook or the butler or whatever he was would give you hot chocolate and cookies. We were always skating on Mills Cove. Ice boats were quite common too. Well, the rich people had ice boats, and some people in town had ice boats. Now, Hoyt House, as I mentioned, there are efforts to restore it, which we're very pleased about. It's just down beyond the Mills mansion. And the Locusts, again, on the right, I chose that picture just because I love the idea of a picnic on the lawn of the Locusts and people so dressed up to go on a picnic. Marion Asher was another one of my subjects. She came to Statsburg in 1938 with her family as a child, and then she moved away after she was married. But Marion came back in 1966. So in interviewing her, I got a different perspective of how the village had changed when she came back to live in the family home. Marion said the Dinsmores owned everything around here at one time. They owned the golf course, the water company, and all the land along Old Post Road up to the school property, and of course the Locusts. The house on that estate was torn down by Helen Huntington Astor when she divorced Vincent Astor and married her husband, Lytle Hull. And John Van Dyke said, the Hoyt House had 3 greenhouses, and I had to keep them fired up at night all winter long. The Hoyts were rich people. They had parties too, but they didn't go overboard like the Mills. Some of the wealthy estate owners really were very good to the town, and they donated land and funded buildings. Charlie Kendall said William Dinsmore was probably the most important part of this community. Hyde Park had basically 3 wealthy families, but I think the wealthy in Statsburg gave more to Statsburg. For example, for the size of this town, they never would have had that firehouse if it wasn't for the Dinsmore money. Dinsmore gave them the land and financed the biggest part of the building of the firehouse, and it was one of the only ones in New York State to have a bowling alley, when bowling alleys were something only wealthy people had. It was the same thing with the school. I truly believe that Statsburg, for its size, had no right to have a beautiful school like that. It was a poor community coming out of the Depression. It was built primarily with Dinsmore money. Again, Charlie was convinced that the people of Hyde Park were a little jealous of us. And we all remember the time when Charlie decided that Staatsburg should secede from Hyde Park. And it made the front page of the Poughkeepsie paper and caused quite a stir. But Charlie was very proud of Staatsburg. He went on to say, this is Charlie again, Dinsmore had that ball field built. It was regarded as one of the finest ball fields between New York and Albany. He brought the man who designed the polo grounds up here. Mr. Dinsmore gave to the community. And you can't see from the aerial view, but there were bleachers, and they were that was absolutely the thing to do, was to go to ball games in Statsburg on the weekends. Lucille Hayes, another one of my subjects, came in 1927 to teach at the Wooden School. She married into the Hayes family, who were farmers, shepherds, gardeners on this Dinsmore estate, the Locusts. And she told me the Dinsmores were very kind to their help. I'll never forget it as long as I live. Every Thanksgiving and every Christmas, they'd give all the employees a turkey. The narrators did tell me about the wealthy families never turning away people in need. They were told if someone came to the door looking for money during the Depression, that they should be given money. And there's a story, an iconic story about Mrs. Mills traveling across Mills Cross Road and seeing a woman carrying water from her well to her house. And it was an elderly person, I believe, and Mrs. Mills said, we need to put running water in that person's house. She shouldn't be toting water. So they had indoor plumbing put in. And again, food at the holidays all the time. Now, here's another interesting story about one of the people who lived in Statsburg, in the house that I showed you, which was the Nori Thompson house. Lewis Gordon Nori is actually an example of what we would call the American royalty, the homes in the Hudson Valley and along the river that were emulating the homes of royalty in England. Because, and I say that only because there's so many interrelationships. So, for example, his family, his father, Adam Nori, was a wealthy banker from New York City, but Lewis's mother, Margaret, was a Staatsburg girl. She was Margaret Lewis Morgan. She was the daughter of Angelica Livingston Hoyt, again, names you keep hearing and will hear, and William Morgan, who bought Stonehurst. Margaret's sister, Lewis's aunt, was Geraldine Morgan Livingston Thompson, and Margaret's great aunt was married to Alexander Hamilton Jr. So again, lots of relationships. Margaret and Geraldine, the two sisters who owned that home with their husbands, they were cousins of Mrs. Ogden Ruth Mills, and Margaret and her sister shared the use of the home. And Lewis's mother, Margaret, was a noted suffragette in the area and did a lot. Of course, the home up here was only a part-time home. Several of the narrators, though, told me they liked to hang out with Lewis when the family was in Statsburg, and he would drive them around in his car. Lewis went on to Princeton University, and unfortunately, when he was a senior, he was killed in a car crash in Asbury Park, New Jersey. He had a bunch of kids in the car. It was 1923. From what I remember of the obituary, they crashed into another car full of kids, and he was only 22 years of age. So the Thompson family, who were, again, his aunt and uncle, gave the land for the Lewis Gordon Nori Playground in his honor. And that was in 1924. And they had a monument built, which is still down there. And what you see on the right is the upper part of the park. And all of this became state park property, the Margaret Lewis Nori State Park, in 1934. But for the people I interviewed, this park was a big, big part of their lives. Lewis Gordon Nori, and they were very appreciative of this park that was established in his name. And we'll see more of the park, and there it is. The waterfront park, the kids, as I said, like to hang out all summer. And one of the narrators, named George Foreman, came to Staatsburg in 1932 when he was 7 years old. His dad had lost his job during the Depression, so they too came back to live with George's grandfather, where they knew, in Statsburg, New York. His dad earned $25 every 2 weeks at the Anderson School farm, and he had 6 mouths to feed. George said, at the dock, there was a sliding board and 2 diving boards, a lower and a higher one. The higher one was probably 15 feet or so. As a kid, it was a big thing. You didn't really belong until you could dive off the high tower. We would go up there and stand maybe half an hour trying to work up the nerve to go off. But if we didn't dive, my older brother and a couple of the other big guys would come up the ladder, and they wouldn't let us down. So we had to go off the high board. And on the left was the beach for the younger kids. We were right at the Hudson River there. There was a beach area, obviously, a little float out there. George went on to say, that park down at the river was our lifesaver. We used to spend all summer long down there. We'd go down in the morning, take a lunch, go home for supper, and go back down and stay until dark. We had a lot of fun down there, a lot of good times. And I did hear all kinds of stories about antics down by the river. They liked to fool the city people and hide under the dock, dive off, hide under the dock, and people would think they had drowned, and the kids had a great time, teenagers and little kids. Of course, we're in Hyde Park, the town of Hyde Park, so a lot of the people I spoke to remembered seeing Franklin and Eleanor, most especially President Roosevelt, when he would sometimes tool through Staatsburg on his country drives. Oliver Goring went to high school in Staatsburg in the mid-1930s, but he lived in Hyde Park. He came up to Staatsburg because Hyde Park schools only went to the 8th grade, so he came up here to finish his high school. I enjoyed speaking with him because his perspective as an outsider was a little bit different. He came to school here. He delivered ice here once he was an adult, but he wasn't actually born here. And Mr. Goring said, my experience with Franklin Roosevelt living in Hyde Park goes back to when I was a kid and sang in the choir. He would come into church, and in those days, he was just Franklin Roosevelt. 1923, 24, 25, the fire department created more of a scene going through town than Roosevelt did. As he became governor, you became more aware of him. And of course, that church was St. James in Hyde Park. And George Foreman told me, of course, there were people around here who hated the Roosevelts. You either hated them or you loved them. My grandfather and I got into some arguments about this. He couldn't stand Roosevelt because he knew him personally, and he always thought Roosevelt was a snob. We used to argue about that. And George Foreman had red hair, and he said Roosevelt used to rub his head and for good luck because he was a redhead. And Roosevelt would come to Staatsburg in that specially designed car that he had that had hand controls because obviously he couldn't use his legs. But they said that car was designed and built in Poughkeepsie, and I had never heard that before. And Mr. Goring said, another involvement I had in Staatsburg was with the CCC camp at Nori Park. They had barracks, a mess shack, and a hospital shack up there in the field. And that would be at the southern end of the hamlet, where if you enter, there's a huge field before you get into Nori Park, and that's where the CCC camp was. excuse me, Mr. Goring said the Civilian Conservation Corps was an emergency relief effort. You enlisted to get in. The fellows were paid, I guess, around $30 a month, plus room and board. They taught them the trades, they gave them work, and they had a place to stay. And I think they got about $6 a month to spend. The rest was sent home to their people. It was one of Roosevelt's efforts to save the economy. The CCC fellows built the Nori Point Inn. They built the roads, the bridges, and the camp area on top of the hill at Nori. And of course, there are some of the CCC guys planning. This is building Nori Point Inn, which was for many years a beautiful restaurant. You can see that on the bottom. And now it's part of the DEC facility. And again, I heard stories about all of these stores down on Market Street. And people said that you only went into Poughkeepsie once in a while to do some big shopping, but it was very self-sufficient. Marion Asher, again. The town was thriving. There were 2 grocery stores at one time, believe it or not. That was in the 1940s, and they were both apparently thriving. On the same side of Market Street, in that row of stores, was Johnny Millard's ice cream parlor. Millard's had the little round table with an ice cream parlor chairs and the soda fountain with the marble tops. He would make you a real ice cream soda. There was a shoe repair shop and a wonderful barber shop and Skouten's meat market. You got good quality meat from a good butcher. You didn't have to go anyplace else to shop. Statsburg had gas stations and a Cadillac and Packard auto dealership. And that's the building on the right that at one time sold cars. We had lots of taverns in Staatsburg of the day. Up on Route 9, there was the Green Bullfrog and the Cozy Inn. And I heard quite a few stories about it. The Cardinal Inn on the left was the Cardinal Inn for a long time, and then many of you may know it as Portofino's restaurant. The corner tavern on the right was right down by the railroad station. And of course, the train stopped in Staatsburg in the day. And people told me about getting off the train from work and stopping in for a drink at the corner tavern. Another thing I was amazed to hear about were these huge hotels that were down in the hamlet in the turn of the century, actually. By the 1940s, they were mostly boarding houses up on Route 9. But prior to that, there had been the Broadfield, the Bromhead, the Statsburg Hotel, and the Cardinal Inn, again, where people could come and stay. We had 3 churches. Obviously, St. Margaret's Episcopal on the left, St. Paul's in the middle, which both are still existing as churches, and on the right is the Methodist Church, the Bethel Methodist, which is now a home that was converted into a home. Birgit Crucius was a lovely woman who was born in 1900, so she was in her mid-80s when I spoke with her. She came to Statsburg in 1919 because her father was asked to work on an estate owned by the housekeeper of Colonel Payne. Colonel Payne left her a great deal of money, and she had a house up on Route 9, and Mr. Crucius came to work as a gardener. I was married at St. Margaret's Church on Easter Sunday. I didn't even have to buy flowers for the altar because every Easter and Christmas, the estate owners would send large, beautiful plants and flowers to decorate the church. Well, we know that St. Margaret's on the left was built in 1891 by Margaret Lewis Livingston, Ruth Mills's grandmother, and Ruth's aunt, Mrs. Lyda Coit. So again, the influence of the wealthy people on the hamlet. And before that, they had used what is now the Statsburg Library as a little chapel. But people wanted to have their own church in Statsburg. And they have very significant stained glass windows in that building if you haven't seen them. Of course, Statsburg had a firehouse, a library, and the train stopping really played a big part in the vitality of the hamlet. There were 2 train stations, one for the northbound train and one for the southbound train. And there was a tunnel that went underneath, so you wouldn't have to walk across the tracks. You could get from one side to the other by an underground tunnel. And I kind of found the oldest picture I could of our wonderful Staatsburg library, which, as I said, was a reading room and was also a chapel to St. Margaret's before it was built. Again, Birgit Crucius told me the train station was always a very busy place. The Mills family used to rent their own private train car to come to their estate. They would pull the cars over to a spur when they arrived and hook them back up to a train when they were ready to return to the city. Miss Phipps always arrived with a poodle under her arm. And Miss Phipps was Gladys Mills, one of the two Mills daughters. Several people talked about how important the train was and taking the train to Poughkeepsie to shop and also to finish high school, because before the brick building was built, the school didn't go finish the last 2 years. And so they would take a train into the city of Poughkeepsie, get off at the Poughkeepsie train station, and walk all the way up to what the high school then was, what eventually became Our Lady of Lourdes. But it was quite a hike. Edith Kidder, who talked about taking a horse and carriage into Poughkeepsie. She was born in 1888, so she has that memory. Marion Asher talked about a bus that came right through the village. So there were a lot more ways to be transported around in those days. And the train station made a big difference. But really, as far as I was concerned, as I spent time with these people, a lot of time, and interviewed them, it really wasn't about the mansions or the parks or the shops that made Statsburg not just a place to live. It was always the people and the caring and the closeness that they had. Lucille Hayes said, I was teaching in Statsburg. Let's go back to this slide. I was teaching in Statsburg when I met my husband. I'll tell you how I met him. I knew who he was, and he knew who I was. The big deal in the evenings was to go to the post office. It didn't close until 7:30 at night, and when the last mail came in, it was sorted, and you went to see if you had any mail. So one night, I went to the post office, and Marty was standing outside. When I went by, he said, "Good evening, Miss Davis." I stopped and talked to him, and that was the beginning. No formal introductions. Everybody knew everybody in Statsburg. Mrs. Hayes also told me stories about teaching at the wooden school and how the kids would tip over the outhouses and those kinds of tricks. And I'm sure you probably know that in those days, women school teachers could not be married. They usually boarded in local houses, but if they were married, they had to give up their positions. So Statsburg was about people, I said, who worked hard, and they were proud of their work. Ice harvesting was a very big industry in Statsburg, and that's Mr. on the Asher farm on the right. Naomi Kraft was born in 1900, and she came to Statsburg in 1906 so her father could work in the greenhouses at Dinsmore. Ollie Goring talked about working on railroad tracks with jackhammers, fixing riprap. So I had to figure out what riprap was, and that's the big, large stone that is on the railroad beds. And he used to work rearranging that and organizing it, I guess. And there was an ice tool factory that was a very big part because of the ice harvesting. They needed ice tools, and the Statsburg Ice Tool Factory on the left. George Foreman told me that it was all run by pulleys and trip hammers, and it was very, very hot in the summer. And when they opened the doors, people throughout the village could hear the noise of the ice tool factory. And Kidder coal was a big industry there. Naomi Kraft was very proud of being the first office girl at Kidder Coal. Statsburg was made up of people who provided services and fueled the basic economy of the hamlet in one way or another. On the left, the horse and carriage, is our own Dr. Harridan, who was here, and I heard quite a few stories about the doctor in the 1920s and the 1930s. And one of them involved actually a late night drinking incident where the teenagers got themselves into a little trouble with some stitches and a middle of the night call to Doc Harridan so that their parents wouldn't have to find out about it. I know that he charged $2 for a house call. Staatsburg people I spoke with were very proud of the volunteerism, again, part of that closeness that they had. And the fire department was thriving in those days. Let's see. Len Peluso in this slide is in the orange jacket on the right. And he came from a family of 13 kids. He spoke with me because he had moved into Statsburg on his wife's family home on River Road in 1948. But he couldn't have been prouder of being a Statsburger. He also liked to tell me about growing up with his father in the Mount Carmel section of Poughkeepsie. He had 13 kids. The dad was a barber who also pulled teeth, because that's what you did in those days. He was a dentist too. Len was a nurse at the psychiatric center in Poughkeepsie, but one day his wife had a very bad fall, and it took a very long time to get an ambulance up to Statsburg. So Len Peluso said to me, Art Flanagan, Jim Horan, and myself started out our rescue squad with a station wagon, a tank of oxygen, and a first aid kit. That was how we started in 1968. That's how we responded to the calls. They were offering EMS courses at Dutchess Community College. So Art and I went and took a course, and we came back here, and we started from scratch. I got first aid training, and eventually we had as many as 20 or 25 volunteers on the squad. And as you can see on the left, they raised money for an ambulance, and we're very proud of the fact that it was all from donations. Of course, during the Depression, I heard a lot of stories about that, and it pulled the community quite close together. George Foreman said to me, "The thing is, from hearing people talk and looking at pictures, they showed you a part of Statsburg with the yachts and the mansions and everything. There was another part of Statsburg too. That's where I came from, the other side. We had 4 kids in our family, and my father lost his job during the Depression. So it was pretty rough. It was tough. I know a lot of times we went hungry. I remember a lot of times my mother crying to figure out what we were going to eat from one meal to the next." Along those same lines, there were people like Jackie Douglas's mother and Mrs. Kidder, Mrs. Radcliffe, and different people in the village who, whenever we went out to play, always made sure they had something to eat for us. So people made sure they looked out for you, and you don't forget that. There was a closeness there, and we all got along together, no matter what we had. I think we were probably better off. I don't know. And I see on the left, there's a young man there with his knickers. And I heard a story from Charlie Kendall that if you had corduroy knickers, they were usually given to you from some charitable organization, and they were very stiff. And when you walked, they rubbed together, and they were called whistle breeches. And he said the kids at school would make fun of him for wearing whistle breeches, meaning that he didn't have much money and had to take handout with his knickers. World War II was another milestone, of course, in a small hamlet like this. And we had our heroes and our heartbreak. And Charlie Kendall again on the left, and the Roll of Honor, which is now, that his names are on a permanent monument down in the hamlet of Statsburg. We're not sure where the sign is, but Charlie Kendall told a wonderful story, and I'm going to go to my book here to read you this little excerpt. Charlie said, "We heard about Pearl Harbor at Mass at St. Paul's. It was sort of the talk of the town that Sunday. The next day, 2 of us went down together to Poughkeepsie Post Office to enlist. Pearl Harbor was close to home, and most fellas didn't need flags to be waved. Jimmy Shuloff and I went to join the Navy. His father was a retired Navy man, and we knew we were going into the Navy. Well, when we got to the post office, it was packed with fellas. The line to the Navy recruiting office was a mile long, so we decided to walk around for a while and maybe come back tomorrow. As we walked by one door, we looked in and we saw this huge man sitting behind a desk. He looked up and he saw these 2 young faces. 'Can I help you?' 'No, we're just waiting for that line to join the Navy to get a little shorter.' the giant stood up in a beautiful blue Marine uniform. And he said, "You're going where?" Step inside and let me tell you a little story. If you don't think Jimmy Shuloff had some job telling his father that we signed up to go into the Marines and that he wasn't going to be a Navy man. Everybody in the hamlet did their part for the war effort. On your left, you see what was called an observation shack. It was at the highest point in Statsburg, up on Mountain View, and it was manned 24 hours a day in 2-hour shifts. And part of that was because we lived in Hyde Park. The feeling was that Roosevelt's home was more vulnerable. So people sat with binoculars. I heard stories of some liquid courage to help them on the night shift. But they did watch, and they took the job very seriously to watch for any kind of enemy aircraft during World War II. And there's Charlie after he enlisted in the service. And of course, the kids in Staatsburg always had the Hudson River, and you heard a lot about that. George Foreman again. Well, I'll just say that the picture on the right is a dayliner, you can see in 1946. And I heard that they would time their swims, a lot of time, their trips, so they could go out and catch the waves from the dayliner. They made incredible waves. George said every weekend the park was crowded with families. They used to have a guy who came down with an old truck. He would sell candy, ice cream, and soda. Frozen Milky Ways were the big thing. If we got one of them, it was great, made our day. During the Depression, there were not many good moments, but down by the river, we had fun, all kinds of good times. The kids had the Statsburg School, big part of their lives. On the right is, I talked about Lucille Hayes before. That was her, Miss Davis was her maiden name, and that was her class, her 3rd and 4th grade class. But someone who spent a lot of time talking with me was Ken Stewart. He worked as a teacher and then as a principal in Statsburg for 37 years. And although I heard stories from the kids' perspective about school, there were some really interesting ones that Ken told us. That told me about families and teachers and all the interesting different ways education, the ways education differed from it does today, that's for sure. So one story from our principal, Ken Stewart. Hyde Park and Statsburg each had 2-year high schools until Statsburg built the new building here in the 1930s. And then all the Hyde Park kids came up here to finish school. When I first came to coach, the principal called me aside and said, "You know, I think you might have some trouble with your basketball team. Half of these kids will be from Hyde Park, and half of these kids will be from Statsburg, and these people don't like each other." I told him I wouldn't have any trouble, and I never did have a bit of trouble. The kids always got along in school together. It was the adults who had the problems, and there was a big rivalry always between the Hyde Park and Statsburgers. On your left is Anna Stevenson, and Ken Stewart, the principal, told me that I coached girls basketball. We had a championship team, and nobody could touch us for 2 or 3 years. We played the big schools, and we beat them all. And then the state discontinued girls basketball. They said it was too tough for girls. I said girls operate the same as boys. And when they were playing basketball, they weren't out carousing around. They were going home tired after practice, and they didn't have a chance to run around. Anna Sinibaldi this is Ken Stewart still, I'm sorry. Anna Sinibaldi was a better basketball player than most of the boys I had. She was nice, so down to earth, just a good gal. They tried to induct her into the DC Basketball Hall of Fame. Anna said, nope, she was no Hall of Famer, and she wouldn't let me put her name up. I told her, Anna, you're better than most of the clowns they're putting in there. She said, no, I didn't do anything to make the Hall of Fame. And Anna went on to be our librarian at the Statsburg Library for many years. Naomi Kraft again. She said, I went to the wooden schoolhouse, which was next to where the brick school is now. I remember one time the principal, Mr. Hicks, said, I bet you people don't even know how to add. Then he made us stay until after 6 o'clock at night, adding up long columns of numbers for him at the blackboard with a pointer stick. I'll tell you one thing, I did learn to add after that. And if there are any educators out there, you know that times have changed quite a bit from those days. But I think George Foreman sums up this presentation the best. I think the biggest thing I'd like to remember about Statsburg was the people and how they looked out for each other. Statsburg was a good place to be, and it still is. We have our problems, but I don't think there's anything that can't be worked out eventually. And I think that applies true for 40 years later. I'd like to thank the family of Ned Ledbetter, who continue to share Ned's photographs from his extensive collection. And if you're interested in more interesting photos of Statsburg or anywhere in New York, NewYorkHeritage.org is we're adding pictures all the time. It's a project that's underwritten by the Staatsburg Library and the Friends of the Library. And we're digitizing all the old photographs we can find, of which there are many, many in the library. And that's our wonderful history committee that's digitizing and entering them onto the NewYorkHeritage.org site. So go there and see some more interesting things. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. That was fantastic. And where can people get your book?
It's available on Amazon. It's available online at Amazon, online at Barnes & Noble. And I think that you ordered some for the history, for your gift shop.
We did indeed. And when we reopen, they will be for sale there. Now, while we wait for somebody to submit some questions, I have a couple of quick questions for you. Now, I know that Rhinebeck is not exactly Statsburg, but there was a family living there sort of on the border in the place that's now called Wilderstein. Do you want to talk at all about Daisy Suckley and the family and their legacy up in that part of the county?
I'm sorry, I don't know much about, I've never done research, but of course we know that Daisy Suckley was a cousin of Franklin Roosevelt, and I think gave him the infamous Fala, the dog. And she lived in her home for many years, a beautiful building that you can now tour. But I do remember a wonderful story that Daisy Suckley, as a single woman, lived in that house, that mansion. And not too far away, she had a sister who also lived in a very large, beautiful house. And they would get together for tea every day, but they never moved in together. So I guess they knew their limitations.
Now, the Hudson River, especially up here, is fairly famous for these very wealthy people who moved up from the city, like the Mills, like others, the Astors, the Vanderbilts. But the Astors particularly were probably, at one point or another, the richest people in America, and arguably one of the richest families in the world. And they have a particular some particular interests. Now, were you familiar with the story about Vincent Astor and his early airplanes?
No.
Yes, apparently during World War I, he funded an aviation unit at his estate there, and it was they would practice landing there on his estate, and he, gave his private yacht to the U.S. Navy during World War I, and then built a bigger yacht, the Norma Hall, which came up on the Hudson River, and then when World War II came, he donated that to the Navy to be used as a sub-spotter.
Wow. Amazing. And that's what I was always impressed with, the fact that they wanted to be married, that Helen Dinsmore wanted to be married at Hopeland and in the little church with all the opportunities she would have had through the Astors and Ferncliff.
Yes. Yeah, well, and that estate up there, which again, it's not in Statsburg specifically, but obviously it's connected by family. The Astor Courts, I believe they call it now, where Chelsea Clinton was married.
Yes. Yep.
It's a beautiful estate that's been renovated. And in the basement, they had a shooting range that Eleanor Roosevelt used to use. And on the first floor, they had the first heated swimming pool in America and the first indoor tennis court.
Wow. That's amazing. Amazing.
But obviously the Mills and the Mills Mansion now and the Mill State Park and that whole, the Nori Mills Park, that's really quite a remarkable piece of land. And they were a family that I think in many ways, transformed the area. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Because I think many people are familiar with the Mills Mansion and the park.
Well, the mansion and the property stretched all the way over across what is now Route 9, and it was huge farms. And I know Mr. Mills was a gentleman. Certainly, that was a big part of the area. I think it was significant that it's the only mansion that doesn't have the railroad tracks between the home and the river. And Mrs. Mills requested that Old Post Road be moved slightly so that she had a grander entrance. And we know that it was rerouted a little bit so that she had a great entrance, which was interesting. And the property, people ask me what happened to all of the homes that were back there and what happened to the great estates. And of course, times changed. I think nobody wanted to take care of those huge buildings anymore. And also the Route 9, which took traffic away from the hamlet. So that, of course, affected their viability because nobody was coming through on their way to Albany, which they always had. So the hotels, the stores, things changed. And once the mansions started to leave the area, the hamlet decreased, obviously, in its services and what its businesses. We still love it. It's a wonderful place, but it's not what it was then. It's true, I think, of a lot of river towns.
Yeah. I see we have a question.
Can you read that? Are you aware?
It says, are you aware of the archive of contemporary music, which has moved to Staatsburg? Over 3 million recordings, memorabilia, and books on music.
I am not. I've never heard of that. That's wonderful to know.
Yes, I didn't know about that either. Where exactly is it located? Was that, sorry, I don't see your name anymore. Was that Renee? Let's see if she can answer that. I was not aware of that. And as a music lover, I'm very intrigued by that. Now, you talked about the kids and the river. There was a period, particularly, in the early 20th century where the river was fairly polluted. Were there any issues around that, around the factories from further up north and the quality of the water in the Hudson River?
No, I think either they didn't know about it or the quality was, I think the quality was much better during those days. I think it wasn't an issue of safety. They had a park supervisor, speaking of safety, who kept an eye on things, who had a home down there. And their kids just always swam in the river and boated. There were little boathouses where they took out boats, and they just really, it was a very, very important part of their childhood. And I don't think the pollution was an issue in those days. And as I said, if they didn't know, they might not just have known about it. But also getting back to the parkland, most of the homes are gone back in there that were, and as probably most people know, that a lot of the wealthy people donated their land to make the state parks, but there were also private homes back there that were taken by eminent domain because the idea was to keep the land contiguous from the Mills Mansion all the way south there to Nori State Park. So there were more homes back there, and if you hike and walk, you can see some of the remnants of those. And the one home that burned to the ground was Stonehurst, the family owned, as I mentioned, by the two sisters. The Anderson School had purchased that for dorms, girls' dorms, and unfortunately it burned, and there are some amazing pictures of what was left of that home. But that was a sad loss. Morgan Hall.
We just got a note back from Rini saying it was located on the Locust Estate. Do you know where the Locust Estate was? Where's that?
Locust Estates is still there. That's the one that's owned by Andre Balazs. That was the Dinsmore family, which were one of the, very generous families. And it's also the one that was torn down, and the newer mansion is there, the lighter 1940s kind of style mansion. So, well, I'm very glad to know it's up there. I'm sure they have a website if people want to see what it's all about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And before we go, I sort of like to ask your favorite memory growing up there, and what's the spot that you go to when you need a moment to reflect?
Well, in all honesty, I did grow up here. That was why, for me, it was very fascinating to be able to hear these stories. I was an outsider, and I will be an outsider probably unless I'm here 100 years. But I think there are just so many beautiful walking trails. Any place I can get to by the river, certainly to go down behind Mills Mansion and walk down by the cove, and actually to be on the river on a kayak. We're just so fortunate to have 1,000 acres of state park and a river and all those beautiful things in Statsburg. And the library. I love the library.
Well, we hope you can come visit us soon. Thank you very much for being with us today, Judy. It was a great talk. Statsburg is a beautiful spot. I love it up there. We hike those woods around behind Mills Mansion, and
good.
It's nice to hear the story behind it and remember what a vibrant community it used to be.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
And we'll be back in a few moments with our final speaker today. The legendary Tony Munoz will be here to talk to us. So we'll be right back.